My name's Tim. I'm an addict. Thank you very much for having me here. Now, it's a difficult topic, this, and I know that there are some fairly new people, so I'm going to try and pitch it in such a way that if you're fairly new, you'll still be able to follow it. Now, before leaping into the question of trusting and relying on God, one has to ask, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to trusting and relying upon me. Now, the reason I can't trust and rely on me is because I'm an addict. And that has several layers. The first layer is that no matter how much I get sick of myself and how much I'm using and the consequences, I can't enter a using environment and not just hit the ground running and go for it and massively overshoot. Now, I didn't realise to what extent I was overshooting when I used, because every time I used a substance, it seemed like a good idea in the moment. But day after day, I regretted it afterwards. And when I was surveying the damage, the debris the next day, I formulated the notion day by day, this time, of course I'm going to get wasted. But not that wasted, not so wasted I'm in blackout, not so wasted I'm ill, not so wasted I'm violent, not so wasted I'm pouring sulfuric acid on the rest of my life. I'm unable to control myself once I start. An automated process takes over. And it's not ordinary desire. Ordinary desire is satisfied by giving the desire the thing that it wants. When I was a child, we lived a long way into the country. And on Friday, I would desire to borrow some books from the so-called mobile library, which would land in our village, and I'd go and get my books and take them home. Acquiring the books I desired got rid of the desire. And that's how ordinary desire works. You get the thing you desire, and you're good now. With substances, you give my desire for the substance, and it doubles the desire. So you know there's something up here. Now, what I've learnt in recovery from the big book, as it's called, is that the reason I'm like that is because I'm like that. That's the end of it. There's no explanation. It's simply an observable fact. And this remained true for years after I first observed this fact. It wasn't that I didn't know what was going on. I knew absolutely what was going on. And yet, time after time, increasingly, I was trapped in that cycle. Whenever I would start, I would overshoot. After a while, that becomes untenable. By the age of 18, that had become untenable. And so, if one can't moderate, the answer is to stop altogether. And I stopped altogether for the first time in 1990. I don't know if anyone remembers 1990, but it was a lovely summer's day, and I thought, I'm done with it. I'd had a pretty crazy night the night before, and I thought, enough is enough. I'm losing my mind here. But I go back to it. I go back to it again and again and again. Now, if you ask the question why in general in life, why is not a single type of question. There are at least two different forms of why. If Susan's become a nurse, and you ask her why she became a nurse, she'll give you her motivations. And she being a person who can make decisions and put them into practice, those motivations, they really explain why she became a nurse. So that those are reasons why someone does something. If you see a cat and it pushes a glass off the table and the glass falls and smashes on the ground, if you could ask the glass, why did you fall on the ground and smash? It wouldn't go into explanations of motivations. Well, I wanted this or I felt that. It's a simple matter of cause. If you're standing in a queue and the person in front of you is annoying you, so you give them a shove, you might have motivations for that. But if the person behind you trips or stumbles, pushes you, and you push the person in front turns around and says, why did you do that? You say, it's not my fault. The person behind me pushed me. And so when I'm saying why did I go back to the substances again and again and again? The trap is to go down the wrong path, to ask the wrong sort of why, to go into my mind and look at what I was thinking, my emotions, my motivations, my circumstances, or even the bigger questions, my childhood, the traumas, the difficulties, the what doctors would call concomitant conditions, the other mental conditions I had. That's asking the wrong question. Because it wasn't a mental process. It wasn't reasoning. It wasn't having jolly good reasons which took me back to substances. Because the point is, whatever reasons I was giving myself, whether they were negative reasons or of emotions I was running from or situations I simply wanted to block out, or positive things I thought I was getting, they are so utterly dwarfed by the whole effect of substances on my life. That presentation of reasoning and motivation makes no sense. It's insane. Except the funny thing was, I can't even pin it on insanity because I wasn't generally insane. I knew my own name. I knew who the Prime Minister was. I knew up from down and left from right. I could cross roads and cook an egg. I wasn't insane, generally. But there was this pocket of what looked like insanity. So this makes describing my addiction really simple. I never ever need to say I used because and then give a list of motivations. I used in order to and then give a list of objectives. I don't need to go down that. I don't even need to cite insanity because I wasn't insane. I was close to the edge in lots of ways, but I was not insane. When you've met people who are genuinely psychotic, you know there's a difference between people who are in very great distress and people who've lost contact with reality. I hadn't lost contact with reality. So you say, well, why? Why did I keep going back? And it's the why of cause, not reason. And the why of cause, you say, well, what is the cause? The same way that the glass, what is the cause of the glass falling off the table? Because it was pushed by the cat. Why did I go back to substances? I was pushed by alcoholism. I was pushed by addiction. There's a little bit of my brain which periodically pumps out a command to me to use a substance. That little bit of my brain, there isn't a person in there with motivations. It's not thinking to itself, it's not feeling anything. We use these helpful images sometimes. My addiction, when I'm in a meeting, my addiction is in the parking lot doing press-ups. But the danger of those, they're great, but the danger is to make it seem as though there's any thinking involved at all. Think of it like a computer subroutine, which randomly just shuts down your computer. That's what my addiction is like. It's random. And that's why in the book, the examples of the people who relapse, they're people who are often in fit mental condition, in fit spiritual condition, with no problems in their lives, who are socially well adjusted, who are even religious, who are quite moral. But there's something wrong with them. And what is wrong with them is spiritual and it's philosophical. And I'll come to what I mean by those, so don't be frightened by those terms. If you imagine a runaway train, I don't know if anyone saw that disaster movie in the 1970s, the Cassandra Crossing. It's emblazoned on my mind, so lots of my imagery comes from that film because it just terrified me. But there's a runaway train. If you have a runaway train, imagine the runaway train with a great big red lever on the inside, which anyone can pull, which will activate the emergency brake. And that's great. You think, well, the train's a runaway train, pull the emergency brake. What is the emergency brake with addiction? It's looking outside the system for the solution. Because the system, my system, can be overridden by that little bit of my brain, the little addiction subroutine, which periodically gives me the command, use, which I cannot oppose. I can put it off for a bit, but I can't fundamentally oppose it. I can't argue with it, because it's not a person you can have an argument with. There's no one there. It's a blank, blind, dumb command. There is only obeying it or trying to fight it in vain for a while. I need something from without the system that can pull rank over that and get between me and acting on that command. And that's what pulling the great big red lever is on the inside of the runaway train, except there's a big piece of glass between me and the lever. What's the glass? Self-centeredness. The relationship with God, which is what gives me the defense against the first substance, is not just God swooping in and saving me like I'm Penelope Pitstop. It's, if anyone remembers Wacky Races, you'll have to explain that to the young'uns, you older folks. God doesn't just swoop in. It's a relationship of labour and service and industry and surrender. So I'm to become what it talks about, I think on page 49, if I'm not mistaken, of becoming an intelligent agent of God, which means I go about the world doing God's business. If I go about the world doing God's business, the defense against the first substance is activated. The little subroutine in my brain says, let's use. But it doesn't do anything. It just poof, and that's the end of it. It's gone. It doesn't convert into action because it's blocked. And that's what the program is about, is removing the glass between me and the big red handle so that I can pull the big red handle, activate the emergency brake, stop the runaway train in its tracks. So trusting and relying upon God is because if I rely on myself, I'm going to follow that command. If I am my highest authority, when that command comes along, it's going to seem like a good idea. And I will just obey it as I obey anything else I think if I'm self-directed. What AA gives me is a system for living where I'm kept out of the decision-making loop entirely. I become the recipient of decisions, not the maker of decisions. So if you've taken step 3, if no one's told you this before, then I've got some terribly bad news for you. You're never going to make a decision. You never need to make a decision for the rest of your life. And woe betide you if you try. Be burned alive by your own decision. Because the decision in step 3 is the decision not to make decisions, but to ask God for decisions. And so I get to go up to the board meeting every morning and ask the board what it wants me, the lowly, humble servant, to do. I don't have a vote in the board meeting. I'm the minute taker. I make a record of what is discussed in the board meeting. That's the end of it. Now, someone might reasonably say, this seems extremely unfair. I've got this tiny little problem of addiction. It's just one bit of my brain which doesn't work. And I have to hand over the running of the whole of my life just because one bit of my brain doesn't work. Now, the answer is yes. I didn't make up the rules. I'm just reporting how the system works. That is the system, I'm afraid. But what sweetens the pill is pages 60 to 62 of the big book, which set out a worked example. And the worked example goes something like this. Let's look at the nifty job you've been doing of living based on your own best judgment. And an examination of how well one has been living based on one's own best judgment will invariably reveal one hasn't been doing terribly well. And even if one's been doing okay, one could do far better. What are signs of not doing okay? Ever feeling anything other than peace, emotional disturbance, attachment to situations you can't control, resentment, grievance, jealousy, envy, fear, anxiety, depression, conflict with others, worry about what's going on in the world, ambitions, the frustration of ambitions, disappointment, despair, difficulties in the workplace, wondering if one's ever going to find a job that one enjoys and which recognises one's own untapped potential, the horror at the recognition that when people get married and they say this is the happiest day of my life, most of them are right and it's downhill from there, and 5 years later they're in the divorce courts. The recognition that however much you improve your body, it will never satisfy the ego. The observation that one can spend hours doom scrolling or just looking at rubbish on the internet thinking my life is passing me by. Why am I looking at this crap? Getting involved in arguments on the internet, going on the internet in order to find people to have arguments with. You could increase the list ad infinitum. I bet you've got and maybe just the tiniest little problem with food, and the tiniest little problem with nicotine, and the tiniest little problem, if you're a man, with addiction to pornography. There are going to be a few little things hardly worth mentioning which need clearing up. That's the nifty job one has been doing, living life based on one's own best thinking. And the clincher is this. The idea was presented to me in my 30s. Someone said to me, "Are you happy?" And after some equivocation, I said no. They said, "When did you think your plan was going to kick in? You've tried to be happy your whole life and you're not happy. Whose fault is that?" Because there are people who are happy. You've got the same planet as everyone else, same opportunities as everyone else, give or take. And I had to realise I'd failed. So what I'm being asked to turn in is not just my addiction, but the hopelessness of living life based on self-will. And that's the line on page 60. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. As with most of the important lines in the big book, they're not the most user-friendly to the person reading them for the first time. So I'm going to put that in plain English for me. If I make lists of all the things I want and spend my life trying to get them, I'm going to fail. I probably won't get most of them. The ones I do get, most of them will disappoint me. Have you ever seen how excited someone is when they got a new job? Are they that excited 2 years later? The excitement is going to wane, and they discover when they unwrap the present it's not what they thought it was. For this, we have something called grievance procedures. No one thinks when they sign on the dotted line excited that they're going to be in a grievance procedure 2 years later. This, you get what you want and it doesn't work. And at some point, you realize this is never going to work. This system is designed to fail. And the ego, to cover its tracks, says, take a substance, take a drug, knock yourself out, and then you won't need to recognize that the system is failing. So what we're offered in the program is not just a solution to the addiction, which consists in the relationship of service to God conferring on me a defense, giving me I'll tell you how that feels in practice. It feels like walking away or literally running away from a dangerous situation in which I could use. It can be a shudder of horror at the thought of using. It can be recollecting the people that would be hurt if I used. Whatever it takes, God will use whatever channel will get through to me. And if the worst comes to the worst, I'll be hijacked by God and it feels like I'm being dragged away from danger against my will. It's extraordinary. That's now been working for 32 years. So it's 32 years since I used, which means that we know that it's working. And it has a pretty good chance of continuing to work if I continue to do what it says on the tin. Some meetings focus on the problems of later recovery, being over 10 years, being over 20 years, whatever. I don't think there are any. I think it's all the same. Sometimes people say they want to do some inventory, some step work to go deeper, or as they say, do a deep dive. I don't believe in depth. I think all we ever do is notice things on the surface. If something wants to come to the surface, it will. If it doesn't and it's not ready, it won't. Don't go digging for trouble. There's enough to deal with what's visible without looking for the invisible. The program is simple, it's straightforward. All I need to do is, if anyone remembers the creosote adverts, it does what it says on the tin, but you've got to open the tin. You've got to do simply the simple actions that it says. How do you do that? Well, I'll give you an example. When it says something like, on awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking, you say, God, please direct my thinking. There's no mystery about how to do it. The reason we have to have workshops on how to do it is to undo the nonsense and to get people to just do what it says. That's why we have to have workshops to explain to people with PhDs and master's degrees and professional qualifications that when it says we ask God to direct our thinking and the meditation means considering our plans for the day, that means the meditation is considering our plans for the day. And by the time you've said that 8 or 9 times, the penny starts to drop. So that's why we have workshops. So the little penny drops eventually, the little man starts dancing. So this trusting and relying on God, the phrase, the bookworms of you will recognise is, I think, from page 68, if I'm right in saying that. For we are now on a new basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. What does trusting God mean? Well, first of all, before I can trust God, I've got to stop trusting myself. What this means is developing a huge amount of skepticism towards the contents of my own mind when my mind is anything other than at entire peace. If I'm disturbed, I'm not seeing things right. And a number of years ago, I'm extremely happily married now. You can't have him, he's mine. I'm extremely happily married. But I had some little psychological difficulties many years ago now. And I said to myself, well, maybe I should do something about that. Maybe I should talk about those to Jonathan. No. Because I was upset, I was prohibited from talking about why I was upset to him, or even leaking the fact I was upset in any way. I was to keep it to myself, deal with it using the program and my trusted confidants. And when I finally woke up out of that haze, I realised if I'd said a damn word of what was going on in my head, that would have been the end of it. Now, people who've watched a lot of television, especially those programs where they tell you how to have relationships, they say, but you've got to be honest, you've got to be authentic, to have intimacy. Intimacy is into me see. So I've got to tell him my thoughts. I've got to tell him my feelings. If I've had a feeling, turn Netflix off. Tell him your little feeling. And if you feel insecure, you ask for a bit of validation, because unless you ask for what you want, you won't get anything, will you? And unless you tell them what your needs are, then they won't know what your needs are. And what we're encouraged to do is basically, it's the interpersonal policy of open borders, no diplomacy. Anything can go out, anything can come in. If you want to kill a relationship, do that. Anyway, I'm getting on to a bit of a sidetrack here. The reason why that looks dishonest but is actually honest is all of that rubbish in my head. When I've got a problem with someone else, my head is full of rubbish. That rubbish is neither true nor real. And to propagate it by saying it to the person it seems to be about is telling them lies. The honest truth in any situation is, I'm fine the way I am, they're fine the way I am, the way they are. And if we both accept each other exactly as we are, we'll get on just fine. And so when Jonathan in that year said to me, are you okay? How are you doing? I'm fine. That was the real truth. Even if I couldn't see it, it was the truth. That was, ironically, the honest thing to say. To say what was in my mind would have been the dishonest thing, because what was in my mind was untrue, was a misrepresentation of reality. I learnt from that and many other situations that I cannot see. I cannot see into other people's minds. I can see only a fragment of reality. I don't know what's going on in Bolivia. I don't know what's going on in Bulgaria. I don't know what's going on in Budley Salterton. I don't know what's going on in any of the other 77 flats in this block. I don't know what I'm going to have for breakfast tomorrow. I've got a pretty good idea, but nothing's certain until I've had the breakfast. I have very few facts at my disposal, and you want me to make a decision? Based on what? There's nothing to make a decision on. So to trust God means, first of all, to stop trusting myself. What a relief! That means I never need to think anything through in the way that I used to, that sort of obsessive neurotic way of thinking things through. I might need to gather some facts. I might need to gather such facts as I can. But I don't make decisions anymore. What it asks me to do is to present the situation to God, to gather, if I need to do some homework, talk to some people, do a bit of research, examine my own experience, do some inventory, revise what the principles of the program are, the steps, the traditions, and the concepts. Fair enough, do all of that. God gave us brains to use, and that's my bit. But the synthesis of those into a picture, and based on that picture, deciding what to do, that is what gets turned over to God. Because God can see round corners. God knows the future. God knows the past. God knows everything. How do we know? Well, this is the definition of God. God is defined as that which knows everything. God is also defined as good. God is also defined as a being that we're able to have some kind of relationship with on simple and understandable terms. So to trust God means to say, you know what? God knows the answer to everything, so I don't need to. All I need to do is a little bit of asking. Now, the instructions for how to do the asking are on pages 86 to 88 of the big book, and there's a bit of extra asking that goes on pages 69 to 70. And that's the stuff on how to solve problems. There's some stuff on 163, 164. We ask God how we can help the man who is still suffering. We ask God for patience, tolerance, kindness, and love on page 83. Patience, tolerance, understanding, and love on page 118. You get to ask God. So I don't need to make up the answers to my questions. I just need to ask the questions. Now, the book is very flattering. It says we're intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation. That makes us look very important. But let's take ourselves down a rung or two. C.S. Lewis, if you're looking for something to read which is non-conference approved but will align with the principles of the programme, knock yourself out with C.S. Lewis. Start anywhere. He talks about a character in a Shakespeare play whose role is merely to avenge someone's death and be killed himself. And the character in the play is known as second servant. So that's my role in life. Not even first servant, second servant. Let's keep me in my place. Now, sometimes people go to God with very grand questions like, what shall I do with my life? We're encouraged not to ask questions at that level. God doesn't trust us, it appears, with answers to questions like that. At no point are we asked to ask questions like that. We're asked to do really one thing and one thing only, and everything else is a variation on this. We consider our plans for the day. What, you mean not for our lives? No, for the day. Not even for the week? No, the day. The month? No, the day. I consider my plans for the day. Now, occasionally in the day I may have to plan something for later on in the year, but that's a different matter. The fact is my focus is what I should do today. God doesn't trust me with more than that. And so all I need to do is ask God. I take my preliminary plans. My life is very orderly. I take my preliminary plans and I say to God, how does this look? Is this a good plan for the day? Is there anything I need to add to it? Is there anything I need to take away? Is there anything I need to change? Maybe you want to tell me how I should approach some of these things. Maybe there'll be a call with a sponsee, a call with a client, whatever. Maybe I need to ask God how to implement some of these things, how to take a class that I'm taking, how to do anything. Whatever I'm uncertain about, I ask God first and foremost. I don't outsource it to someone else. I ask God. The only way you learn is by asking God, putting it into practice, messing up, learning from it, and then you do that about 10,000 times and you get better at it. If you outsource it to someone else, then you never learn because you're not taking responsibility for the process. So each day, what relying on God means is simply that, not worrying about next week, next month, next year, my whole life, the hereafter. I don't need to worry about any of those. I just need to concern myself with the day. Now, someone might reasonably ask, But how does a person ever make big changes in their life? Surely, sometimes big changes are necessary. Now, I change what I do for a living. I'm not one of those people that has a career, heaven forbid. The people I know with careers seem so depressed. I'm lucky I simply do something for a living instead. I have a livelihood. I changed my livelihood 20 years ago. Now, I didn't do that by waving a little magic wand and making a big decision or having a massive realization. I did it through 1,000 little actions, and each action was guided by God, and I just moved from stepping stone to stepping stone to stepping stone to stepping stone to stepping stone, and within 2 or 3 years I found my life completely different. I didn't need to say at any point, what shall I do with my life? I simply followed the course that was laid out, like a hedgehog following breadcrumbs. Hedgehog. That's what I am, a hedgehog. It's very simple. That's what relying on God means. So trusting God, I say God knows best. And what the book says, and you're given the opportunity to either believe it or not believe it. What came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands was better than anything we could have planned ourselves. And I can attest to that in the last 33 years I've been in the world of recovery, that's been the case every single time. When I got into the designer's role of my life, I jumped from frying pans into fires. Everything seems to be going terribly well since I gave up. And it took about 8 years. It took about 8 years after I first did the steps before I really gave up. You have to burn yourself alive in your own cauldron first. That seems to be how it works for most people. Thinking you're doing God's will, but really you know it's your own plan. You've reasoned, you've argued why something is God's will. God's will doesn't need an argument. If you're having to argue why it's God's will, that's the end of it. Forget it. You're lost. You've lost because you're arguing. Judge Judy once said to someone, stop talking, you're winning. And it's the other way round with this. Stop talking, because that means you're losing. Why are my lips still moving? I'll say to myself when I'm distressed. Why am I still talking about my distress? Now, this trusting God, what you might say is, but terrible things happen in the world. Is God going to preserve me from those? There are two parts to that answer. As I proceed with this very simple program, I just ask God what to do and I do it. There we go. That's basically what it boils down to. Bugs the hell out of other people, but that's what I do, and it works very well. Now, the first part of the experience is that almost everything turns out spectacularly well. But there's no guarantee everything is going to go your way. So a few years ago, my best friend started using again and died rather grotesquely. So that didn't go to plan. That wasn't my plan. But all through that experience, even though my emotions were what they were, and you can imagine, this person had been the closest friend I'd ever had, the person I'd been arguably closest to in my life. I was fine throughout the whole of that because I had God. Absolutely fine. The waves on the surface of the ocean do not damage the ocean. Being stuck in self is like being a little boat on the surface of the ocean in the middle of a storm. What happens when you work the program is you don't end up in an ocean-going liner, because otherwise you're just as in trouble. Look at the Poseidon adventure. You go from being a little boat on the ocean to being part of the ocean itself, and no storm can damage the ocean. And that's why you can trust God. It's because you're raised to a higher level, and one simply operates in the material world, but one's home is elsewhere. And with 4 seconds to go, I'm going to stop. Thank you.